Hi, it's Justin Colletti of SonicScoop, and thanks for joining me for this week's episode of the SonicScoop podcast. And today, I'm going to be answering a question that has come up a few times that I haven't answered in dedicated podcast form. And that is, what is the difference between multiband compression and dynamic EQ? When should you use one and not the other? And we're going to cover a lot of ground today. If you don't know what multiband compression or dynamic EQ are, I'll explain that real quick. Then I'll explain how they differ, and then I'll give you a sense for the different ways you might want to use each of these in either a mixing or a mastering context. Let's just dive right into it. Just to catch people up who aren't familiar with these terms, multiband compression is a type of compressor where instead of compressing the whole signal at once, you're dividing it up into bands. So you might just be compressing the bass only, and then the whole rest of the mix. That would be a 2-band compressor, right? You could have 3 bands. You could have a compressor that's just doing the low end, one that's just doing the mids, and one that's just doing the highs. A really common version of this you might see would be a 4-band multiband compressor. You got one on the lows, one on the low mids, one on the high mids, one on the highs. Multiband compression. Dynamic EQ has become more popular more recently, and the idea with dynamic EQ is very similar. But you've got these EQ-shaped filters. You can have a boost or a cut like you would in a normal EQ, or a low shelf or a high shelf, and do EQ dynamically. So instead of just doing a low cut always, you're doing a low cut, but only when the low end gets high enough to trigger a threshold. So a dynamic EQ is an EQ that kind of kicks in whenever a threshold is passed. But you'll have controls like you would on a normal compressor, things like attack, things like release control. You'll have those compressor-like controls. So what is really the difference under the hood? And in what situations would you use either of these types of devices? Great question. We'll get a little further into it right now. We've kind of addressed what they are. Now let's go into how they're different under the hood. And the answer is they aren't. Yes, multiband compressors and dynamic EQs under the hood are basically the same thing, a compressor or multiple compressors with different types of filters. And that's really all that there is to it. To give you a little bit more of a technical background understanding of this, you could create a multiband compressor in your own DAW. If you don't have a multiband compressor plugin, you can create one right now. Here's what you'd do. You take a stereo mix, right? Just a song, whatever. You put it in there, some 2-track stereo mix. And then duplicate it 2 times. So you've got the same stereo track twice. You could put a low pass filter on one of those tracks, so you're only getting the low end below 100 hertz. And then on the other track, you could put on a high pass filter, so you're only hearing the stuff above 100 hertz. And then put a separate compressor on each. Voila, you've created a simple 2-band multiband compressor. There are more ornate ways of doing this, using auxes and sends and all sorts of other things. It's not where we're getting to today. This is a podcast, so it's kind of an audio format. I think showing you ways to create a multiband compressor inside your DAW would both A, require some visual aids to help you get it right, and B, would be completely unnecessary because just go get a multiband compressor plugin. There's probably a bunch of free ones out there. If you have a free one you like or a cheap one you like, let us know in the comments down below. I use the multiband compressor in iZotope's Ozone all the time. I also use their dynamic EQ quite a bit, but there's a whole bunch of great ones. The Fab Filter, a million companies make things like this. I believe Plugin Alliance has one. Universal Audio, I think, has one. Waves has multiband limiter that's been quite popular. But you could theoretically create one with, really basic stock plugins if you didn't have one of those built into your DAW. Multiband compressors kind of came into prominence first because you could kind of make them back in the hardware days and it wouldn't be too hard. I mean, it'd be a little bit hard, but one of the earliest types of kind of multi-band-ish compressor was a de-esser, right? And a de-esser is just a compressor with a really fast attack time that's set to just compress high frequencies. So that's like a selective band compressor would be a de-esser. It's technically not a multi-band compressor because you're not dividing things into multiple bands and compressing them separately. You're just selectively compressing one area. But that brings us to the idea of a dynamic EQ. Selectively compressing one area. Really, really specific area. In a really, really specific way. And I want to get a little bit deeper into that. But before I do, I'm going to give the briefest of shout outs to our sponsors for this week's episode. Man, I gave you a lot of juice before we got to the sponsor section. Help me squeeze out the juice of the sponsor section before we squeeze out the juice of the rest of the episode. How am I doing with this analogy? You tell me in the comments down below. The sponsors for this week's episode include Focusrite, who make the lovely Focusrite interface that I'm speaking into right now. Never gave me a lick of trouble. Focusrite Claret. They also make really, really inexpensive stuff like the Scarlett series, one of the most popular interface lines in history, and really, really nice high-end stuff. I had a bunch of high-end Focusrite pre's back in the day. So thanks to Focusrite for sponsoring. Also, big thanks to Sound Toys for being a sponsor on this episode. Once again, Sound Toys, check out anything they make for free at soundtoys.com, making some of the most interesting creative mixing effects out there. All right. Let's get back into it without further ado. Dynamic EQ. Selectively compressing a particular area in an even more selective way than you could with a multiband compressor. Because with a multiband compressor, like we talked about, you're limiting the basic bandwidth that's going to go into the compressor, and then you've got a normal compressor, right? So in a multiband compressor that's got 4 bands, you've got splitting the signal up in 4 different ways with high pass and low pass filters on each. So you're just taking one specified band and then you're putting a compressor on top of it. But the biggest difference with a dynamic EQ is just that the filter shapes are different and more varied, and I think give you even finer control over the compressor, and sometimes can be more intuitive and easy to work with. It's almost, think of a dynamic EQ as being a little bit like a really variable, powerful de-esser. You could just use one band of dynamic EQ. And here's one of the big differences. With a multiband compressor, you're not really doing multiband compression unless you're doing at least 2 bands, right? You're compressing the low end separately and you're compressing the rest of the stuff separately, for example. But with a dynamic EQ, you could instead think of it like a de-esser, but a de-esser that goes anywhere. You're not necessarily just de-essing high frequencies. You could use dynamic EQ and only dynamically EQ the low end. And that's actually something I do a lot in mastering. These days, more and more, since dynamic EQs have been invented, one of the greatest applications for me is doing stuff that I originally would have done with a multiband compressor, trying to get some extra control on the low end without just cutting a bunch of low end. But a dynamic EQ allows me to do that with much finer control, really zooming in and zeroing in on exactly what I want to affect. So, just as an example, if I had a problem with the low end on a track in a mastering context, and rather than just cut down the low end, I wanted to add some control and not have the low end cut all the time. I'd only want to cut some low end when the kick drum comes in, and that kick drum just has a bit too much bottom end. With a multiband compressor, I would have had to find the spot, hey, everything below 100 hertz or below 200 hertz or below 150, whatever it is, I'm going to compress that stuff separately and then set up a compressor on it. But I can be a little bit more surgical and a little gentler with a dynamic EQ. And I can go in and just use that one band, not even put a compressor on the upper stuff, and just go in there and say, okay, let me take a little peaking filter with a dip around 150 hertz. Let me try it with a narrower Q. Let me try it with a wider Q. And now I can dip just around 150 hertz without affecting the stuff below 150 hertz. I mean, theoretically, you could do that the multiband compressor to a degree, right? You could have 3 bands. One band that only compresses up to 100 hertz, one that compresses from 100 to 200 hertz, and one that compresses from 200 hertz up. And the only one that's doing anything is that middle band. You can kind of do that with a multiband compressor, but you still don't have the fineness of control that you do with a dynamic EQ. Dynamic EQ will give you those attack and release settings that you'll find on a multiband compressor. But it'll also give you, like I said, the ability to widen and narrow the bandwidth, if we're talking about a peaking or a dip filter here. But in addition to allowing you to do that, it will also let you set really easily a limit to how much you want to duck by. I only ever want this EQ to duck by 1.5 dB. Or the maximum dip is going to be 2 dB. You can also do the opposite. You could have it when your kick drum hits, you could have it act like an expander, just bringing up the low end, but only when the kick drum hits. And you could have it bring it up only by half a dB, only by a dB. You can have it bring it up by 5 dB if you want to, but again, only when the kick drum is hitting. So that kind of stuff is possible with a dynamic EQ. Another way I love to use dynamic EQ is as a de-esser. Like I was saying before, dynamic EQ and a de-esser, really kind of the same concept, but I think of a dynamic EQ as a go-anywhere de-esser, where I can tame hi-hats, cymbals, tambourines, S's, have multiple de-essers on the same track with this dynamic EQ. Or maybe a little bit of a mid-dip, maybe around 500 hertz, only when things are getting congested, we're sucking down. And again, it has the option of acting like an expander, where we can pull stuff up. You want those hi-hats to come out even more, but only when those hi-hats are really triggering. You could do that with a dynamic EQ. So what's the difference between a multiband compressor and a dynamic EQ? Only the filters, only the interface we're using to access what is under the hood, basically a compressor. And that's it. Where do I still use multiband compressors these days with, I think, an even more powerful and sophisticated tool, dynamic EQ, which is much more transparent? Where do I still use multiband compression? And not as much as I used to. I see multiband compression, at least in mastering, as a fixer tool, as something where I can go in and here's the biggest place I would have ordinarily used a multiband compressor in mastering. Often enough, we're in a situation where we're putting compression or limiting on a master, on a 2-track, but we don't want the kick drum or the bass to kind of dominate what's happening in that compressor or limiter. So a big thing that's been the norm for a long time in mastering is in cases where there's way too much low end, which happens with some degree of frequency, to take down the low end a little bit. Maybe a dB, maybe a dB and a half, maybe filter out some of the super lowest stuff and genres that can handle that. And now we're not hammering the mix bus or the mastering compressor or the limiter with all this extra low end. But that's not always going to work, because sometimes you want things to not hammer your mix bus compressor, but you don't want to reduce the bass that much. You don't want to reduce the kick that much. You don't want to reduce the amount of low end. So a multiband compressor could be good for that. Just split your signal in two. You got a separate compressor on your low end, separate compressor on everything else. That'd be a common way to use it. Another way I described just a little bit earlier, break it up into 3 bands, where we're trying to compress that middle section, say everything between 100 hertz and 200 hertz, but not compress as much in the lowest stuff or further up, where we're trying to really control something. Multiband compressor could be used in a different way, in a particularly harsh or sibilant or bright sounding track. We want to kind of smooth out some of the transients with really fast attack compressor on all the high end stuff. That's another good place to use a multiband compressor potentially. So you're compressing everything in the track one way that allows the transients to come through, things stay punchy, but the upper stuff, maybe you're smoothing out more. But again, more and more, I'm just finding those things are often easier to do with a dynamic EQ in a way that's even more transparent, even lighter touch, and even more precise. There's still a place for multiband compressors. I don't even know how to articulate it, why I would still go to one. In the 20% of time now, I go for a multiband compressor instead of a dynamic EQ during mastering. But if you have favorite ways, tell us about it in the comments down below if you're on the YouTube version. And or shoot me a email at podcast@sonicscoop.com if you've got your own favorite ways to still use a multiband compressor and why you think they're still better or more useful in the age of dynamic EQ. So definitely let me know. And if you haven't already, for the love of goodness, smash the living daylights out of that like button if you're on the YouTube version of this podcast. It really does help spread the word. Also, if you haven't yet, and you're listening to the audio-only versions of this podcast, it helps me tremendously, so incredibly much, if you give this a 5-star rating and review on the iTunes. I guess it's not the iTunes anymore. Now it's the Apple Podcasts. And just click the 5 stars, type in a 1-sentence review if you can. It absolutely helps this stuff get out to more people. And I consider myself your virtual bestie every time you do that. So thanks for checking out this week's episode of the SonicScoop podcast. I hope that was a good, overall useful primer if you're confused about what a multiband compressor is, how you might use a dynamic EQ, etc. Last question I want to answer for you before I let you go is how to use this stuff in mixing. I've been talking about mastering again. You don't that often, with a couple of exceptions. One is you've got stuff that's all congealed into one track, like you get stereo rooms or stereo overheads, and you got too much hi-hat or too attacky of a cymbal or too much kick drum or not enough kick drum in that stuff. Or even on a drum bus, potentially, you could use on things where everything's baked in together, a dynamic EQ or a multiband compressor to refine things slightly, smooth out those cymbals or bring out more cymbals, contain that kick drum or bring out more kick drum, make sure the mids don't get too overbearing on certain hits or make the mids poke out even more. You absolutely could do that, but most people aren't going to do it most of the time in a mix. You could, though, on an instrument that has a diverse tonality, an electric guitar or a bass where occasionally a certain note is popping out, use a dynamic EQ or a multiband compressor in a de-essery kind of way, where you're just controlling the things that get a little bit annoying, but only when they get annoying. You could also do that on a voice, say a female vocalist who gets a little nasal now and then. You're just taking out, wherever it is, 1.8K, I don't know. You tell me on the particular imaginary vocal we're talking about here, where you're going to do it. The dynamic EQ can, again, dip down things when they poke out just a little bit too much, but only at a certain frequency that happens again and again throughout the song. So those are some general ideas for how to use it in mixing. Big shout out and thanks to you for sponsoring this podcast by smashing the like button and or giving us a 5-star rating review on the podcast platforms. It really absolutely does help. And thanks also to our sponsors for sponsoring the podcast, including Focusrite, making some of the coolest, best interfaces out there. Check out Focusrite interfaces if you're in the market for an interface. Also, Soundtoys, making some of my favorite creative mixing effects in the known universe, such as the Echo Boy, the Devilock Deluxe, a million other things. Definitely check them out, soundtoys.com, where you can try out anything they make for free. And also, if you want to go even deeper on mastering, which we've been talking about a lot today, you can get my free primer on mastering, free 40-minute workshop. Gives you the basics of mastering called Mastering 101. You can check that out, SonicScoop.com/mastering101. That's SonicScoop.com/mastering101. Got a full-length course on mastering as well called Mastering Demystified. I recommend you check out. And if you want to go even deeper on mixing, you can check out a free workshop called The 5 Habits of Truly Great Mixers at SonicScoop.com/mixhabits. That's SonicScoop.com/mixhabits. Thanks again for hanging out with me. This has been Justin Colletti of SonicScoop. See you next time.